The first light of dawn had yet to breach the grey horizon when the village stirred with an uneasy whisper. At the edge of Rosewood Hollow, where the cobblestone lanes twisted like coils of smoke and ivy clung to the old brick houses as if holding them together, an unsettling silence had been broken. The silence, which usually carried the calm of pre-dawn serenity, had been replaced by something far stranger: footsteps. Footsteps heard by Mrs. Cartwright, the housekeeper of a stately old manor, as she crept along the upper corridor, checking the rooms before the rest of the household awoke. They were not the steady, measured steps of a resident or guest, but light, almost hesitant, like someone testing the air, weighing each move carefully. Yet the house had been locked from within the night before, every door bolted, every window latched. The thought made her heart pound, but curiosity edged out fear, and she followed the sound down the shadowed hallway. By the time the clock in the hall chimed 4, the footsteps had ceased abruptly, leaving behind an oppressive stillness. Mrs. Cartwright found the library door slightly ajar, though she was certain she had left it closed. Pushing it fully open revealed a scene that made her knees weaken. Mr. Henry Bramble, the manor's reclusive master, lay sprawled on the Persian rug, eyes staring into the dim ceiling as if frozen mid-thought. There was no blood, no obvious wound, nothing to suggest violence, yet he did not breathe. The only anomaly was a small, peculiar object beside him, a single ivory chess piece, a knight, placed delicately as though meant to convey a message. Nothing else in the room seemed disturbed. The windows, as expected, remained locked, and the heavy oak door bore no signs of forced entry. By the time Inspector Grayson arrived, summoned urgently by the panicked housekeeper, the early morning fog had begun to curl through the village, softening the sharp edges of the world. He was a practical man, accustomed to the chaos of the city spilling into sleepy towns, yet the scene puzzled him in a way that sharpened the edges of his unease. No sign of struggle, no sign of forced entry, and yet someone has been here. It's almost theatrical, he muttered, crouching to inspect the night. His trained eyes saw what Mrs. Cartwright had not, the delicate scratches along its base, faint but deliberate, as if it had been moved across a surface repeatedly. A message, perhaps, or a taunt, he added, uncertain. It was Miss Marple, arriving quietly as the mist clung to the rose bushes outside, who first noticed the subtle irregularity that eluded even the inspector, while he examined the obvious, the absence of a weapon, the locked windows, the impossible logistics. She studied the room's air, the faint trace of lavender, the tilt of the chess piece, the slight depression in the rug where Mr. Bramble's weight had pressed it down. "It's too simple, yet entirely complex," she murmured, almost to herself. "People often overlook the smallest things when they're expecting the grand, but the grand is rarely what it seems." She leaned closer to the ivory knight, fingertips brushing its surface, and sometimes a clue is not meant to be understood by fear or logic, but by observation and intuition. As the morning unfolded, Miss Marple spoke with the household staff, her questions gentle but persistent, teasing out nuances that no one else had considered noteworthy. The cook mentioned seeing a shadow move past the garden wall late last night, though dismissed it as the wind. The gardener recalled a faint rustling of leaves around the manor's old well. Every detail seemed trivial until stitched together by Miss Marple's patient mind, forming a lattice of possibilities. The housekeeper's recollection of the footsteps before dawn became central, the irregular rhythm suggesting someone familiar with the manor's every crevice, yet careful not to leave traces. The notion of a simple yet impossible entry began to crystallize, a passage overlooked by those who assumed doors and locks were the only barriers. Miss Marple paused in the library, letting the silence settle around her. The footsteps, she realized, were more than a sound. They were a signature. Whoever had approached Mr. Bramble had done so deliberately, choosing the timing and the manner to unsettle rather than to harm directly. The placement of the night, the untouched state of the room, the absence of alarm, all pointed to someone who understood the psyche of the household intimately, someone who wanted the discovery itself to provoke thought, perhaps even fear. It was a puzzle designed not for the victim, but for those left behind. By midday, the villagers gathered outside, drawn by rumour and curiosity, while the inspector continued to search for tangible evidence. Miss Marple lingered in the library, examining the pattern of sunlight falling across the floor, the subtle scuff marks invisible to ordinary eyes, and the delicate curl of dust displaced on the shelves. Her mind worked quietly, weaving the ordinary and the extraordinary into a picture only she could perceive. The crime appeared unsolvable, a riddle with too few answers and too many questions, yet she felt a steady certainty, the kind that precedes revelation. Somewhere in the soft creases of the manor, in the rhythm of footsteps that no one else would notice, lay the key to understanding why Mr. Bramble had died, and who, in the stillness before dawn, had been careful enough to leave behind a whisper of a message. A night, silent and deliberate, in a room of impossibilities. Miss Marple's presence in the manor seemed almost ethereal, a quiet disturbance against the rigid order the inspector tried to impose. While Inspector Grayson instructed the staff to recount every movement from the previous evening, and the police meticulously dusted for fingerprints, she moved like a shadow slipping from one room to another, noticing what had not been touched, what had been moved, and what seemed entirely out of place yet perfectly ordinary. In the drawing-room, she paused beside a small writing desk, her eyes resting on an envelope left slightly askew atop a stack of papers. At first glance it appeared unremarkable, just another piece of correspondence among many, but its position was strange. The papers beneath it bore no indentations from handwriting or weight, suggesting it had been placed deliberately after the stack was arranged. Turning it over, Miss Marple noted a faint smudge on the corner, almost invisible in the diffuse light of the early morning. "Curious," she murmured, tapping the envelope lightly with her fingernail. A hand that meant to hide but left itself in plain sight. Meanwhile, the inspector had gathered the household in the grand hall, pacing briskly as he questioned each person, expecting the truth to emerge under pressure. His eyes darted to the staff's reactions, noting hesitations and stammered responses, yet he chalked them up to shock and nerves. Miss Marple, however, saw subtler signs, a flicker of impatience in the cook's eyes when asked about last night's movements, a slight overemphasis in the gardener's tone when he insisted he had gone straight home. To most, these were trivialities, but she catalogued them carefully, mentally aligning them with the small anomalies she had already observed. It was in the library once more, as the morning mist thinned and sunlight crept across the rug, that she noticed the most telling detail. The chess knight, once thought a random, almost whimsical clue, was slightly rotated, as though it had been turned to face the door after Mr. Bramble's body had been discovered. That shift was subtle, something an ordinary observer would never register, yet to her it spoke volumes. Someone had revisited the room, adjusted the piece, and left with deliberate care. Not just a message, she whispered, almost to herself. A signature of movement, a whisper of intention. A soft creak in the corridor drew her attention. The housekeeper had returned, ostensibly to check on the servants' quarters, yet her eyes flickered toward the library in a way that was neither casual nor accidental. Miss Marple's gaze followed, noting how the woman's hand lingered just slightly over the banister, almost as if she were measuring her own steps. A tiny tremor in the hand, a breath held too long. These were the subtle signatures of anxiety, or perhaps of someone who had something to conceal. By mid-morning she had assembled a mental map of the manor's interactions, where footsteps had been heard, who moved when, and the small deviations from normal routine that were easily dismissed. The inspector, methodical and thorough, was frustrated by the absence of direct evidence. "We have nothing," he admitted, running a hand across his forehead. "No signs of forced entry, no weapon, no fingerprints beyond the household's usual circulation. Miss Marple, however, was beginning to see a pattern emerge, not yet a full picture, but enough to hint at the outlines of deception. The envelope on the desk, the faint smudge, the rotated chess piece, the fleeting tensions in the staff, all suggested that the apparent simplicity of Mr. Bramble's death was a carefully constructed illusion. Someone in the house knew the household's rhythms intimately and had used that knowledge to create a scene that misled both the authorities and the casual observer. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the inspector's voice from the hall, calling for a search of the cellar, prompted by a vague recollection from the gardener of a noise heard late at night. Miss Marple's mind, however, was already elsewhere, piecing together the delicate lattice of ordinary objects and ordinary behaviours that hid extraordinary truths. There was deception here, subtle and precise, and the first signs were now clear. The story of Mr. Bramble's final hours was being whispered not in grand gestures or overt acts, but in the smallest details: the footsteps before dawn, the careful rotation of a chess piece, the almost imperceptible tremor of a hand. As the household moved toward the cellar, Miss Marple lingered in the library, bending low to examine a faint impression on the rug where the knight had rested. It was a mark so slight that it would escape any casual eye, yet to her it was a signature of intent, a movement repeated, practiced, a hand guided by purpose. She straightened slowly, eyes narrowing. The investigation had begun, but the game had only just been set in motion, and the first whispers of truth were hidden among shadows that even daylight had not yet fully revealed. By late morning, the manor had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The household gathered once more in the grand hall, though the tension had thickened like fog. Inspector Grayson moved methodically from person to person, taking notes, asking questions in his clipped professional tone. Miss Marple watched silently from a corner, her keen eyes taking in more than the spoken words, the slight hesitation, the posture that stiffened, the glance that darted away. Every interaction was a small ripple on a surface she knew could hide deep currents. The cook spoke first, her voice firm but tremulous. She claimed to have gone straight to bed after finishing her final chores, confident in her account. Yet Miss Marple noticed how her hands fidgeted with the hem of her apron, twisting the fabric almost imperceptibly, and how she avoided the detective's gaze when asked about the unusual footsteps. I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary," the cook said quickly, almost too quickly. "Just the wind, perhaps." Miss Marple made a quiet mental note. Eagerness to cooperate often masks something more. The gardener, a wiry man with sun-baked skin and a sharp, nervous glance, offered a different version. He insisted he had been in the garden until nearly midnight, tending to the frostbitten plants, and had seen nothing amiss. Yet, as he recounted the details, he repeatedly corrected himself, revising the timing and the sequence of movements. Each adjustment was subtle, but Miss Marple caught the pattern, a mind attempting to reconstruct events not from memory but from anticipation, as if he feared being caught in a lie. The housekeeper, Mrs. Cartwright, provided her own account, describing the footsteps she had heard just before dawn. She was precise and calm, yet Miss Marple noticed a slight tension in her shoulders, a nervous tightening around the mouth when asked if she had checked all the rooms. "I did my rounds as usual," she insisted, "though I confess the sound. It startled me. But I found nothing unusual." Her words were true in essence, but her body betrayed a subtle uncertainty, as if she had witnessed more than she was willing to admit. The butler, normally stoic and dependable, seemed almost overly composed. He offered to demonstrate the locking of each door and window, showing the inspector the security of the manor. Yet Miss Marple observed that his fingers lingered, slightly longer, over the lock on the library door, the very room where the body had been discovered. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight. Someone was unconsciously drawn to the location of the crime, whether from guilt, memory, or simple habit. As the questioning continued, contradictions began to emerge. The cook's timeline clashed with the gardener's. The housekeeper's recollection of the footsteps seemed to shift in subtle ways under pressure, and the butler's insistence on demonstrating locks felt rehearsed. Each story had the sheen of truth, yet contained fractures that hinted at hidden motives or suppressed information. Miss Marple noted them all, cataloguing the discrepancies with the precision of a mind that understood how small lies could weave into a larger deception. It was during a lull, as the inspector stepped out to confer with the local constable, that Miss Marple finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady, drawing the attention of the household. "People often tell the truth in pieces while leaving gaps where the lie resides," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "A misplaced word, a hesitant gesture, the order of one's movements, these are the voices of deception, and they speak louder than any denial." She moved closer to the group, letting her eyes rest briefly on each individual, catching the slightest flinch, the micro-expression that revealed unease. "Someone here has shaped events to appear simple, perhaps to mislead. Yet no matter how carefully a story is constructed, it leaves traces, small footprints in speech, in gesture, in the patterns of daily life. The truth rarely remains entirely hidden when observed with care. The atmosphere in the hall shifted. A few faces paled, others tightened, and a hush fell over the room. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, almost detached, as if listening to a symphony that only she could hear. Each narrative, each small contradiction, was a note in the composition she was beginning to assemble. The inconsistencies suggested opportunity, knowledge, and above all, intention. The game was no longer abstract. The players had revealed themselves, and the investigation was moving toward the delicate task of untangling the threads of deceit woven tightly around the seemingly impossible death of Mr. Bramble. By the time the inspector returned, Miss Marple had already mapped the subtle tensions and contradictions, her mind turning over possibilities and probabilities with quiet, relentless focus. Each witness had spoken, but their words had done more than recount events. They had signalled motives, hesitations, and secrets. Somewhere within the layered accounts lay the key to understanding not only who had approached Mr. Bramble before dawn, but why the scene had been arranged with such careful precision. The voices of deception, once harmonized in her perception, were beginning to sing the faint outline of truth. As the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, Miss Marple retreated to the quiet of the library once more, letting the world of the grand hall and its restless occupants settle behind her. She spread out her mental map of the household, tracing threads between the subtle deceptions, the contradictory statements, and the faint marks left by invisible hands. Each person's story was plausible in isolation, yet when viewed together, a pattern of overlapping motives and hidden resentments began to emerge. It was a maze, complex and labyrinthine, and she could see how the inspector's linear approach struggled to navigate its twists. The cook, for instance, seemed above suspicion at first glance, her devotion to routine meticulous and unwavering. But Miss Marple remembered the small flinch when she was questioned about the footsteps and the slight nervous tugging of her apron. Perhaps she feared something, or someone, was being concealed. A careful mind could weave motives from even the most benign actions. The cook had once been reprimanded by Mr. Bramble for a minor oversight in the kitchen, a slight that, in isolation, would have been forgotten, yet it could ferment quietly into resentment over time. The gardener, whose nervous glances and constantly corrected timeline had already drawn her attention, also had reasons to act beyond the simple care of plants. He had recently been denied a position managing the estate's grounds, passed over in favour of a younger relative of Mr. Bramble. Pride bruised, ambition thwarted, and the opportunity of a quiet pre-dawn hour could have seemed irresistible to a man who felt wronged. Miss Marple filed the thought away, noting it as a possibility rather than a certainty. Mrs. Cartwright, the housekeeper, presented perhaps the most confounding set of motives. She had long maintained a strict hierarchy among the staff, a power that could be threatened if Mr. Bramble's attention shifted to others, or if changes in the household disrupted her carefully balanced control. Furthermore, She had been entrusted with access to keys, knowledge of routines, and even some correspondence, means by which subtle manipulations could be executed without detection. Her cautious demeanour was genuine, but behind it Miss Marple sensed a mind acutely aware of how leverage, secrecy, and timing could shape outcomes. Even the butler, outwardly calm and disciplined, carried motives of his own. Loyalty could breed resentment in a household where favour and disfavour were carefully measured. He had occasionally complained in private about what he perceived as injustices, small slights that had been ignored. The manor was full of opportunities for someone with insider knowledge to act discreetly, and Miss Marple could see how the right combination of timing, routine, and small manipulations could allow a death to appear natural or unsolvable. Miss Marple began constructing an intricate web of connections, grievances, ambitions, and fears intertwined with the household's rhythms. It was not a simple matter of greed or jealousy alone. Each thread interacted with the others. A seemingly minor slight could reinforce an unspoken rivalry, while suppressed fear might magnify a sense of opportunity. Every suspect had a reason to act, yet no single motive could explain the careful choreography of the scene. No single desire accounted for the placement of the chess piece, the silent footsteps, and the precise timing. She pulled a chair closer to the desk where the ivory knight had rested and allowed her mind to wander across the patterns of movement she had already observed, the rotation of the chess piece, the faint smudge on the envelope, the subtle scuff marks on the rug. Each tiny deviation was not random, it was a signal, a deliberate choice made by someone who knew the house and its inhabitants intimately. The motive behind the act could be tangled, but the method spoke of familiarity, precision, and a mind capable of careful planning. As the day wore on, Miss Marple listened to the household, letting snippets of conversation float into her awareness. The frustrated sighs, the casual criticisms, the veiled complaints hidden in polite speech. Every interaction, no matter how mundane, offered a clue to the internal dynamics. The web was complicated, a maze in which greed, resentment, ambition, and fear were all interlaced. And within that maze, she knew, was the path that led to the truth. The subtle combination of motives that had guided a hand to approach Mr. Bramble before dawn and leave behind a scene designed to confound even the most diligent investigator. By evening, as shadows lengthened across the manor's corridors, Miss Marple sat quietly in the library, folding each thread of the day's discoveries in her mind. The individual motives were clear, yet the complete picture remained tantalizingly just out of reach. Still, she sensed the edges of the web beginning to converge, the disparate strands slowly revealing a pattern. The maze was complex, but a patient mind and an observant eye could find the root. Somewhere within these intersecting desires and secret resentments, the truth waited, whispering its presence to the one willing to trace its subtle signs. The following morning brought a sense of cautious optimism to the manor. Inspector Grayson, emboldened by a sudden lead, had summoned the household to the drawing-room, holding a small, folded note that had been discovered in the gardener's quarters. Its contents were vague but pointed, a cryptic message referencing Mr. Bramble's last movements and implying knowledge of the household's routines. The inspector, convinced this was the missing link, began to announce that the case was nearly solved. "It seems clear now," he said, tapping the note against the arm of his chair. "Someone within the house had access, motive, and opportunity. We may finally have our culprit." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. Relief mingled with tension, some nodded eagerly, while others looked uncertain. The gardener, who had been under subtle suspicion, appeared increasingly flustered, muttering explanations that, on the surface, seemed to corroborate the note's implication. The inspector, satisfied with the apparent breakthrough, called for the authorities to prepare for formal questioning and possible arrest. "A simple, tidy resolution," he said with a grin. "Exactly the kind of result one hopes for in such a perplexing case." Miss Marple, however, remained seated quietly in a corner, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze unfocused yet sharp. The note itself, though intriguing, left a strange residue of doubt in her mind. Its phrasing, too precise, too pointed, carried the unmistakable mark of deliberate construction. Someone had written it knowing it would be found, intending to direct suspicion in a particular way. She watched the inspector's satisfaction with a quiet unease. This was the sort of moment when the outward simplicity of an investigation masked the deeper currents beneath, the currents that could mislead even the most diligent investigator. She rose and wandered back into the library, allowing the early sunlight to trace patterns across the rug where Mr. Bramble had fallen. The chess knight still rested slightly rotated, a small but deliberate anomaly that had not changed despite the flurry of attention. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over it, recalling the faint smudge on the envelope. The subtle impressions in the rug, the minute misalignments she had catalogued over the previous 2 days. The note, she realized, was a diversion, a false victory meant to shift focus, to create the comforting illusion that the mystery had been solved. Her attention turned to the staff once more, particularly the housekeeper, whose careful demeanour had barely faltered throughout the questioning. The note had prompted a subtle change in her posture, an almost imperceptible stiffening as if she were trying not to reveal that she knew more than she should. Even the gardener's increasingly nervous behaviour seemed rehearsed, exaggerated just enough to support the false narrative implied by the note. Someone was orchestrating the scene, guiding the investigation like a puppeteer pulling strings from behind the veil. As Miss Marple's mind sifted through the evidence, she became aware of a rhythm, the hidden footsteps, the precise rotations of the chess piece, the timing of movements throughout the manor. They did not align with the story suggested by the note. Whoever had left it was clever enough to anticipate the inspector's eagerness for resolution, yet not clever enough to obscure all the traces of truth. The real criminal was still at large, watching from the shadows, their intentions obscured by layers of misdirection. By midday, the inspector had begun formal preparations to act on the supposed breakthrough. Miss Marple, however, had already returned to the drawing-room, subtly steering her attention to the gaps in testimony, the inconsistencies too small for the inspector to notice. The gardener's alibi, once reinforced by the note, now appeared shaky under the scrutiny of her quiet observations, slight discrepancies in timing, unexplained movements in the hallway, and a pattern of hesitation in recounting events. The housekeeper, though outwardly calm, bore a similar tension in her voice when asked casually about her rounds. Miss Marple's eyes fell upon the chessboard, where the knight remained like a sentinel. It was an ordinary object, yet in its careful positioning lay the signature of intent, the hand of someone who understood both the household and the minds of those investigating. The note could not account for this, nor the subtle manipulations that had guided attention away from the true sequence of events. The criminal had allowed the authorities a moment of triumph, a false victory to instill confidence and lull suspicion. She folded her hands and looked around the room. The tension had shifted slightly. The household breathed a tentative sigh, and the inspector prepared to act. Yet beneath the surface, the current of the investigation had not run its course. The threads of deception were still interlaced, the motives still tangled, and the true culprit remained poised, patient, and unseen, waiting for the moment when the carefully constructed illusion would crumble. Miss Marple, however, felt the faint pulse of certainty in her mind. The false victory was merely the overture. The deeper, hidden truth was quietly revealing itself, one imperceptible detail at a time. That evening, as the manor's lamps flickered to life and shadows stretched long across the walls, Miss Marple returned to her corner of the library, her mind tracing the patterns of the day. The false victory had unsettled her, not because it misled the authorities, but because it highlighted what she had long suspected. The true nature of the crime was deeper, rooted not in a single grievance or opportunity, but in connections that spanned years. The threads she had been following were tangled not only among the household members, but with a past that had lain dormant, quietly shaping the present. Her attention fell once again on the ivory knight, its delicate surface catching the lamplight. There was something deliberate in its placement, something familiar, though she could not immediately name it. Then a memory surfaced, one of those details that seemed insignificant until suddenly it became the key. Several years ago, in a neighbouring village, there had been a case of subtle manipulation and quiet revenge. A minor dispute between a household staff and a wealthy, reclusive employer had ended in a death ruled accidental, though whispers suggested otherwise. The methods had been delicate, precise, almost invisible, footsteps timed to mislead, objects placed to convey a message, and letters arranged to guide suspicion. Miss Marple's mind connected the dots. She had read the local papers of the time, and while she had never pursued the case formally, the details lodged in her memory. A few of the names and roles mirrored those in the Bramble household. The gardener, the housekeeper, and even the butler had acquaintances or distant relatives who had been involved in the past incident, or at least aware of it. Could it be coincidence? Perhaps, but the meticulous staging of Mr. Bramble's death now suggested an echo of that earlier scheme, a blueprint repeated in a slightly altered form. She rose and quietly wandered the corridors, noting small inconsistencies she had catalogued over previous days, the faint impressions on the rug where the night had rested, the delicate scuff marks near the library door, the subtle smudge on the envelope. Each of these was a signature of intent, a deliberate act, but now she considered them through the lens of history. Someone familiar with past schemes of subtle misdirection, someone schooled in the art of deception, had recreated those methods with precision. In the dining room, she observed the staff as they moved quietly, preparing for dinner. Their interactions were polite, but under the surface, patterns emerged. The gardener lingered a fraction too long near the bookshelves. Mrs. Cartwright's eyes traced movements around the table that seemed rehearsed. The butler adjusted a chair with a precision that suggested more than mere habit. Miss Marple realized that these were not isolated quirks. They were echoes of the past, inherited behaviors or learned strategies, tools passed down and adapted for a new purpose. A subtle connection crystallized in her mind. The gardener and the housekeeper, long-time colleagues, had shared history with that earlier case. Their families, perhaps their mentors, had taught them how to manipulate perception, how to arrange evidence to lead investigators astray, how to craft a crime that appeared at once simple and impossible. The butler, too, had ties. His loyalty and familiarity with such schemes were cultivated over years of observing and assisting. The crime was no longer merely about Mr. Bramble or present grievances. It was a continuation, an inheritance of tactics, a choreography perfected across time. Miss Marple returned to the library, eyes resting on the chessboard once more. The night was not merely a random clue or a playful riddle. It was a symbol, a deliberate signature pointing to someone versed in these older methods. The crime had roots deep in the past, and its current manifestation was shaped by knowledge passed down, by lessons learned in shadows long forgotten. The seemingly ordinary household, with its polite manners and routine order, was in reality a stage where patterns of deception had been rehearsed, honed, and now executed with precision. As the night deepened, she sat quietly in the lamplight, tracing the web of connections, noting the inherited skills, the long-standing familiarity with misdirection. The past had come alive in the present, hidden in the gestures, the careful rotations of the chess piece, and the subtle manipulations of perception. The criminal was no longer simply a member of the household acting on immediate motives. They were part of a legacy of careful planning, shadows of the past shaping each decision, each movement. And now, with the pieces aligned, Miss Marple felt the unmistakable certainty that the true pattern of the crime was beginning to reveal itself. A pattern that spanned years, whispering through the quiet corridors of the manor, and the lives of those who had learned the art of concealment long before dawn had ever broken. The following morning Miss Marple arrived earlier than usual, before the household had fully shaken off the lingering tension of the previous day. While Inspector Grayson was content to rely on tangible evidence and interrogations, she had decided to try a different approach, one that did not depend on documents or fingerprints, but on the subtler language of human behavior. She had long believed that people revealed themselves not only in what they said, but in what they unconsciously did when confronted with the unexpected. Today, she intended to put that theory to the test. She called the household together in the drawing room once more, asking them to participate in a seemingly trivial exercise. "I thought it might lighten the morning," she said gently, producing a small tray of objects, a handful of ivory chess pieces, a few keys, and a folded piece of paper that appeared entirely blank. "Let us each take a turn and simply place one item where you feel it belongs on the table. No explanation necessary." The instruction was simple, almost childlike, yet Miss Marple's mind was attuned to the reactions it would provoke. One by one, the staff approached the table. The cook, hesitant at first, placed a pawn near the edge, then stepped back and smiled awkwardly, glancing around for approval. The gardener placed a bishop, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary, as if measuring the effect of his action. Mrs. Cartwright arranged a rook, precise and deliberate, but her eyes flickered to the chessboard in the library, betraying an unspoken concern. And finally, the butler approached, his movements smooth, measured, almost rehearsed. He hesitated over the blank piece of paper, then, after a careful pause, folded it and tucked it into his pocket, as though its contents, or lack thereof, were a test he instinctively needed to control. Miss Marple observed each action with unerring patience, noting not just the objects chosen, but the subtle signals surrounding them, the hesitation of a hand, a shift in posture, the brief glance that lingered too long. When the butler pocketed the blank paper, her eyes narrowed slightly. The gesture was unnecessary, irrelevant to the exercise, yet it carried an unmistakable weight, a reaction born of either fear or the instinct to conceal something that others had overlooked. After the exercise concluded, she allowed a few moments of silence before speaking, drawing attention to the chessboard she had left in the corner. "It is often said that objects can speak more truth than words," she remarked softly. "They are silent witnesses, revealing what one hopes to hide. Sometimes merely observing how someone interacts with them can uncover more than direct questioning ever could." The butler shifted in place, a subtle tension rising in his shoulders, and a flicker of unease crossed his usually composed expression. Miss Marple's eyes, keen and patient, caught the micro-expression, a slight tightening around the eyes, the faintest tremor in the hand as it adjusted the hem of his coat. The reaction was small, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to her it was unmistakable, a crack in the carefully maintained facade. She allowed the moment to linger, letting the household feel the weight of her attention. The other staff remained composed, some with curiosity, others with polite apprehension. Yet the butler's behavior had shifted imperceptibly. The instinctive response to the unconventional test had betrayed a hidden anxiety, a subconscious recognition of exposure. Miss Marple had seen this before, a person trained to conceal, suddenly revealed by an unexpected circumstance that they could not entirely control. Later, in the quiet of the library, Miss Marple reflected on what she had observed. The conventional clues, the letter, the footprints, the subtle manipulations of the chess piece remained vital, but this unconventional exercise had illuminated something deeper. The butler's reaction, fleeting though it had been, marked the first tangible manifestation of internal conflict, a subtle signal that the person most trusted, most composed, carried within them the echo of knowledge, perhaps even complicity. By evening, Miss Marple had already begun arranging her thoughts, connecting this revelation with the patterns she had traced through the past, the inherited knowledge of manipulation, and the subtle choreography of the crime. The unconventional clue, born not of physical evidence but of human nature itself, had provided a fissure in the wall of deception, a crack that, once widened, could reveal the truth hidden in the shadows of Rosewood Hollow. The investigation was no longer merely a search for ordinary facts. It had become a careful reading of intention, instinct, and reaction, and she knew the breakthrough was now quietly within reach. The following morning, a crisp wind blew through the manor, stirring the curtains and carrying a sense of quiet urgency. Miss Marple had spent the early hours retracing her observations from the previous day, reviewing the subtle clues, the gestures, the micro-expressions that had revealed so much. The butler's fleeting reaction during the unconventional exercise weighed heavily on her mind. It was the first tangible fissure in the carefully maintained composure of the household. She had intended to speak with him privately that morning, to probe gently for inconsistencies, when an abrupt commotion drew her attention. Inspector Grayson's voice rang through the corridors, tense and sharp. "The library," he called. Miss Marple hurried toward the source, her intuition already warning her that something had shifted. She arrived to find a small crowd gathered, the staff clustered at a respectful distance, faces pale, hands wringing aprons or clutched notebooks. The library door, once locked and secure, now hung slightly ajar, revealing a scene that made her stomach tighten. The ivory knight, the subtle symbol of intent she had studied so carefully, was gone. The inspector stood rigid, staring at the empty space where the chess piece had rested. "Impossible," he muttered, voice tight. "I distinctly saw it there yesterday afternoon. It has vanished without a trace." Miss Marple moved closer, eyes sweeping the shelves and floor with methodical precision. No smudge on the rug suggested a struggle, no fingerprints beyond the ordinary were apparent on the surfaces. The knight's disappearance was deliberate, almost surgical in its execution. Her mind raced as she considered the implications. Whoever had taken it understood its significance, knew that it carried meaning beyond the ordinary, and had acted swiftly to remove it from sight before it could reveal its secrets. The household murmured among themselves, anxious and uncertain. The gardener shuffled his feet nervously, casting furtive glances toward the corner where the chessboard had rested. Mrs. Cartwright adjusted her apron with unusual rigidity, eyes flicking toward the inspector and then away. Even the cook, who had remained largely silent, appeared unsettled, her hands twisting a dish towel almost obsessively. Miss Marple noted it all, storing the reactions as another layer of evidence, subtle yet telling. Inspector Grayson demanded a search of the manor from attic to cellar, a meticulous sweep to uncover any clue that might explain the disappearance. But Miss Marple recognized the underlying truth immediately. This was not a matter of oversight. The vanishing of the knight was a preemptive strike, a deliberate act to hinder the investigation. It spoke of cunning and foresight, of someone who understood the weight of small objects in unraveling truth. She lingered near the empty space where the knight had rested, allowing her mind to piece together possibilities. The disappearance suggested access, opportunity, and an understanding of what the authorities, and perhaps even she herself, had overlooked. It was a warning, quiet yet unmistakable, that the path to revelation would not be straightforward. The criminal, whoever they were, had anticipated scrutiny and acted to protect the carefully constructed illusion. Miss Marple then turned her attention to the behaviour of the household. The butler, already marked in her observations from the previous day, now seemed more guarded, his every gesture precise, almost rehearsed. The housekeeper's eyes lingered too long on the empty space, betraying a tension she struggled to conceal. The gardener fidgeted, as if the removal of the knight had disrupted a mental sequence he relied upon. Every reaction was a small window into motive and opportunity, and she catalogued them carefully, understanding that while the physical piece of evidence had vanished, the psychological traces left behind were perhaps even more revealing. By late afternoon, the inspector, frustrated and impatient, declared that the search had yielded nothing. The knight, along with any potential messages it might have carried, had vanished entirely. Miss Marple, however, remained composed. She understood that the disappearance, while troubling to the authorities, provided insight into the mind of the criminal, precise, deliberate, and aware. Trust within the household had become fragile, each glance and gesture now charged with suspicion. The investigation stakes had risen dramatically. and the path to the truth would require sharper observation, patience, and a careful reading of human behaviour. Miss Marple sat quietly in the library as the evening descended, letting the lamplight cast long shadows across the floor. The vanished night was no longer a tangible clue, but its absence was itself a statement, a challenge to her deductive skills and a signal that the criminal was not finished. The game had shifted, the pieces on the board had moved in secrecy, and the true test of wit and perception was only just beginning. She smiled faintly to herself. The investigation was no longer merely a search for evidence, it was now a careful dance of observation, patience, and insight, and she was ready to follow the subtle signs wherever they might lead. The manor had fallen into a tense hush by nightfall. The search for the vanished knight had failed, leaving the household anxious and uneasy. Shadows clung to the corners of every room, and every footstep on the polished floors echoed too loudly, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the library, traced the patterns of behaviour she had observed over the past days. She could feel the invisible hand of the criminal shaping events from afar, guiding suspicion, and manipulating the household like pieces on a board. But even as she pondered the next move, an unmistakable unease prickled her mind, a sense that the game had shifted in an unexpected direction. It began subtly, with a quiet knock on the library door that was unusual for this hour. Miss Marple rose, setting down her notebook, and opened it to find the gardener standing there, pale, hands trembling. "Miss Marple, it's the cook," he whispered, voice tight. She's gone." Within moments the household converged, drawn by the urgent news. The cook, normally diligent and dependable, had vanished without a trace. Her bed was untouched, her personal effects left behind, yet her absence was unmistakable. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, taking in the expressions of shock, fear, and confusion on the faces of those gathered. The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line, the butler's hands clenched tightly at his sides. The gardener's eyes darted nervously. Each subtle reaction was a ripple in the larger current of tension now enveloping the manor. Inspector Grayson, frustrated and increasingly alarmed, barked orders for a search of every room, every hidden corner, and even the grounds beyond the house. Yet even as officers scoured the estate, Miss Marple's mind raced through the implications. The disappearance of the cook was no accident. It was a deliberate act designed to distract, to intimidate, and perhaps to prevent the revelation of information she might have provided. Whoever was orchestrating these events was bold, patient, and several steps ahead. The previous theft of the chess knight now appeared as a prelude, a warning that the criminal could manipulate both objects and people to protect their secrets. A sudden movement at the far end of the hall drew her attention. The butler had left his usual place beside the fireplace and was now pacing, his expression tighter than before. Miss Marple noticed the flicker of hesitation in his gait, the subtle glance over his shoulder as though expecting someone or something. Her intuition told her that he was aware of more than he admitted, yet his composure remained intact enough to avoid drawing suspicion from the inspector. It was a delicate mask, but one that could slip under the right circumstances. Minutes later, a commotion erupted in the garden. The gardener had discovered a note pinned to the ancient oak tree near the estate's entrance. Miss Marple approached, reading the careful handwriting, "Do not pursue too quickly, or the next will vanish." The message was unmistakable, a taunt, a warning, and a promise all at once. The criminal was not merely content to manipulate events, they were escalating, creating tension and fear to control the investigation. The stakes had risen dramatically. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, connecting the threads: the vanished knight, the cook's disappearance, the cryptic note, the subtle behaviours of the butler, the housekeeper, and the gardener. Each element was part of a larger design, a choreography intended to mislead and delay. But she also recognized an opportunity within the chaos. Panic could lead the perpetrator to overreach. Fear could create mistakes that revealed the hidden pattern. The criminal's confidence was both a shield and a vulnerability. As the household regrouped in the drawing room, Miss Marple spoke quietly, her voice carrying calm authority. We must remember that fear can be used against us, but it also illuminates the mind that wields it. The actions we see, the vanishings, the thefts, the threats, are all intended to obscure a single truth. If we observe carefully, we may still find it. She glanced at the inspector, noting the fatigue and tension etched into his face. The investigation was no longer merely about reconstructing Mr. Bramble's death. It had become a race against time, a challenge to prevent further harm while unravelling a carefully concealed plan. Somewhere in the manor, or perhaps just beyond its walls, the criminal watched, patient and calculating, confident in their control of the unfolding events. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the window, the fading light casting long shadows across the gardens. The game had changed, suddenly, more dangerous, more urgent, but she felt the quiet thrill of anticipation. The unexpected twist had proven that the villain was still several steps ahead, yet it also offered insight subtle and precise into the mind behind the actions. She knew that understanding the method behind the chaos would be the key to predicting the next move, and perhaps before another life was endangered, preventing the final act of the carefully staged drama. The manor was quiet again, but the tension lingered like an unshakable fog. The cook's disappearance had unsettled everyone, even those who tried to appear calm. The inspector's frustration simmered just beneath his composed exterior, and the staff moved with an almost theatrical caution, as if their own gestures could betray them. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly observant, her mind weaving through the days of small inconsistencies, overlooked gestures, and half-spoken truths. She had long suspected that the criminal's cleverness relied on misdirection, but she now began to sense that a subtle thread ran through every action, connecting what had appeared at first glance to be disparate events. It was in the drawing-room, while the household recounted yet again the sequence of events, that Miss Marple's attention settled on something almost laughably trivial, a faint indentation on the back of the dining-room chair where the butler had often sat. It was a minor mark, invisible to anyone else, yet in the context of the previous days it suddenly took on meaning. She recalled how he had handled the unconventional exercise with the chess pieces and the blank note, how his composure had slipped ever so slightly, and now the imprint suggested repeated handling of a small object that had gone unnoticed by all but her careful eye. The pieces of the puzzle, which had seemed scattered and contradictory, began to align. Her mind returned to the vanished ivory knight. The theft had seemed bold and disruptive, but now she considered that it was not random. It had been the pivot around which the criminal's actions rotated. The butler's small, habitual gestures, the precise rotation of the chess piece, and the subtle way objects had been moved or adjusted over the past days all pointed to someone who understood both the household and the minds of those investigating. Each act was not merely a step in concealing evidence, it was a consistent signature, a psychological fingerprint that revealed method beneath the chaos. Miss Marple's thoughts shifted to the housekeeper, whose careful attention to routine had seemed prudent, almost excessively meticulous. She now realized that these habits were not just diligence, they were a reinforcement of the criminal's design, a way to stabilize perception while the true pattern unfolded. The gardener's nervous corrections in his timeline, the cook's sudden disappearance, and the note pinned to the oak tree were all elements meant to distract and mislead, yet each bore subtle consistencies: the timing, the choice of objects, the specific rooms targeted, and the way attention had been manipulated. As she spoke quietly with Inspector Grayson, who had begun pacing restlessly by the fireplace, she outlined what had occurred. "We have been looking at the obvious and missing the ordinary," she said. "The truth is rarely in grand gestures. It is in the rhythm, the repeated habits, and the subtle choices that everyone else overlooks. Observe the movements, the objects, the glances. These are the constants amidst the apparent chaos." Her eyes drifted toward the now empty library corner where the knight had rested. A small detail, almost insignificant, the slight misalignment of the chessboard on the table, the faint indentation from the knight, and the subtle smudge on the previously blank envelope, clicked into place. The theft, the unusual behaviors, and the orchestrated distractions were all part of a carefully maintained sequence. The criminal had relied on fear, misdirection, and the assumption that small actions would go unnoticed. And yet these small actions had left a consistent pattern waiting to be read by someone patient enough to notice. Miss Marple stood slowly, her gaze sweeping across the household. "The pattern has been here all along," she said softly, almost to herself. "It is in the steps, the objects, the gestures, and the moments of hesitation. The criminal has tried to hide in plain sight, but the signature is unmistakable once one begins to observe with care. The chaos of the past days, the vanished night, the cook's disappearance, the cryptic note, the subtle misdirections, was no longer random. It was deliberate, methodical, and consistent, revealing a mind that had orchestrated each element with precision. The seemingly insignificant details, when read in sequence, formed a map to the truth. The culprit was someone intimately familiar with the manner, attuned to the behavior of those around them, and confident that ordinary actions would obscure extraordinary intent. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. At last the tangled web began to unravel. The pattern had emerged, delicate and precise, hidden in plain sight, waiting for an eye attuned to observe the ordinary and see the extraordinary beneath. The breakthrough she had been waiting for was no longer a possibility. It was now clear, tangible, and inevitable. Miss Marple spent the late morning in quiet contemplation, seated by the tall window in the library, the light shifting slowly across the polished floor. She had traced the subtle patterns, catalogued the habitual gestures, and discerned the deliberate misdirections, the invisible threads that connected the vanished night, the cook's disappearance, and the cryptic note pinned to the oak tree. But a deeper truth, one she had only glimpsed in fragments, had yet to crystallize. Motives, she knew, were rarely singular. They layered and intertwined, and in this case the surface reasons, greed, jealousy, or fear, were only the outward expression of something far darker. It was the housekeeper's brief, almost imperceptible pause earlier that morning that had triggered the final piece of insight. Mrs. Cartwright had moved through the manor with her usual precision, yet her gaze had flickered ever so slightly toward the servants' quarters when asked about the cook's absence. The micro-expression, half surprise, half something unspoken, replayed in Miss Marple's mind. She began to see the crime not as a spontaneous act or a single vendetta, but as a carefully nurtured obsession, one that had taken root over years. Returning to the pattern she had observed in the placement of objects and timing of movements, Miss Marple considered the butler's composure and the subtle ways he had sought to control perception. Every deliberate gesture, every slight hesitation, every careful adjustment of objects suggested a mind seeking reassurance, a mind compelled to impose order on chaos that existed only within its own perception. The criminal had not acted for wealth, for inheritance, or even for petty revenge. They had acted to protect an idea, an illusion of control and significance that had consumed their inner world. The revelation struck her fully when she recalled the vanished ivory night, its precise removal, and the methodical way the cook's disappearance had been orchestrated. The object had never been important for its material value, and the cook had not been targeted for personal gain. They were obstacles, witnesses to an intricate psychological design. The criminal's obsession had been with the subtle orchestration itself, the satisfaction of manipulating perception, shaping the actions of others, and creating the illusion of inevitability. The crime was, in effect, a performance, and everyone in the household had been both audience and unwitting participant. Miss Marple began to reconstruct the psychological sequence of the perpetrator's mind. Each act, the rotation of the chess piece, the careful placement of objects, the theft of evidence, the staged distractions, was intended to demonstrate mastery, to confirm a sense of intellectual dominance over both the household and the investigation. The criminal's willingness to go to such extremes, to escalate from misdirection to disappearance, revealed the depth of compulsion, a need to assert control, to bend reality to an internal design, and to prove, above all, that their perception of order and influence could not be challenged, she traced the connections between the butler, the housekeeper, and the gardener, noting the subtle inheritance of behaviors and knowledge. These were not coincidental, they were skills learned over time, passed along and perfected, all of which had been marshalled in service of the criminal's psychological imperative. The obsession was not rational, it was rooted in a personal mythology, a belief that the criminal's understanding of order, timing, and human behavior conferred ultimate authority over reality itself. Miss Marple's insight coalesced in a quiet, deliberate clarity. She understood now why the criminal had orchestrated events with such precision, why each seemingly minor detail carried significance, and why the investigation had been deliberately misdirected at every turn. The motive was not wealth, not revenge, not even petty ambition. It was the assertion of control over perception itself, a compulsive need to manipulate, to observe, and ultimately to dominate the reality of those around them. As she observed the staff once more, their movements cautious and alert, she realized the extent to which the hidden motive had shaped every interaction, every gesture, and every misdirection. The criminal's psychology was laid bare, visible in the choreography of the household's recent days. The extremes to which they had gone, the vanished night, the disappearance of the cook, the calculated distractions, were all expressions of this deeper obsession. The revelation was chilling, yet illuminating. The crime was not merely an act against a single man, but a manifestation of a mind that sought mastery over reality itself, and would go to any lengths to achieve it. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady and unwavering. The pattern, the motives, and the psychology of the perpetrator were now clear. The case, long clouded in misdirection and subtlety, had revealed its true heart, and with that understanding, she knew the next steps, not simply to identify the criminal, but to anticipate their moves, to predict their manipulations, and to prevent further escalation before the obsessive mind behind the murder could assert its control once more. Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon arranging the threads of her understanding into a careful plan. The pattern had emerged, the hidden motive revealed, and now it was only a matter of drawing the criminal out, compelling them to reveal themselves through action rather than words. She moved quietly through the manor, observing the subtle nervous behaviors of the staff, the butler's restless hands, the housekeeper's quickened glances toward the hallway, the gardener's slightly faltering step whenever the door creaked. Each micro-expression confirmed the truth she had long suspected. The person who had orchestrated the events was still among them, tense, aware, and desperate to maintain control. She summoned Inspector Grayson to the library, explaining her plan in her calm, deliberate voice. "We need to give the criminal an opportunity to act, to reveal themselves through instinct rather than careful deception," she said, spreading a small collection of the remaining chess pieces across the table. "The key is predictability. Those who cannot resist the compulsion to manipulate will take the bait, and their actions will betray them." As evening fell, Miss Marple and the inspector arranged for the household to gather in the drawing-room under the pretense of a routine check of valuables and belongings. The atmosphere was taut, each movement amplified by the manor's silent anticipation. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe all entrances and exits, her gaze sweeping the room for any incongruities in behavior. The chessboard, subtly shifted, lay at the center of the table, and nearby she placed a small note, blank to the eye but carefully folded in a manner reminiscent of the missing knight, designed to provoke recognition and temptation. The first moments passed uneventfully. The staff kept their distance, exchanging nervous smiles and polite glances. But Miss Marple had anticipated this lull. The criminal would not reveal themselves immediately. Then, without warning, the butler's gaze locked on the chessboard. His fingers twitched, a barely perceptible movement toward the folded note. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, observing the internal struggle in his posture, the hesitation, the minuscule bite of his lip, the subtle tightening of his jaw. It was the classic reaction of someone compelled by habit and obsession, a person driven to act despite knowing the consequences. With quiet authority, Miss Marple addressed him. "You've had quite the opportunity to manipulate events, haven't you? The pattern, the rotations, the minor distractions, they were all yours to arrange. But now it is time to speak, or the truth will act for you." The butler froze, caught between impulse and fear. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, his hands hovering inches from the note. The room held its collective breath. Then, with a sudden, almost desperate motion, he snatched up the folded paper and opened it, revealing the blank interior. Miss Marple's eyes remained steady, her calm presence a silent pressure that left him no space to retreat. "I see it now," he whispered, voice trembling. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I only wanted to prove that I could control it, control them all, control everything." His words, halting and raw, revealed the depths of the compulsion that had driven every calculated action. The vanished night, the cook's disappearance, the cryptic note, they were all manifestations of the same obsessive need to assert dominance over perception, to orchestrate reality itself. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "And that need has caused harm beyond what you intended. Mr. Bramble is gone, the cook was endangered, and yet the pattern remained clear. It was never about wealth nor simple revenge. It was about control, and now control ends here." The butler sank into a chair, the fight leaving him, replaced by the stark reality of exposure. His hands trembled as he admitted the full extent of his actions, confessing how he had orchestrated the theft of the night, the disappearance of the cook, and the deliberate distractions meant to mislead the investigation. The housekeeper, his long-time accomplice in minor manipulations, remained silent, her posture stiff, but Miss Marple's glance caught the flicker of guilt that betrayed shared knowledge. Outside, the inspector had already signalled for authorities to secure the household. There would be no chance for escape, no last desperate act beyond what had already unfolded. Miss Marple watched with serene satisfaction as the threads she had so patiently traced coalesced into the final revelation. Every object, every hesitation, every misdirection had been accounted for, and the criminal psychology, the hidden motive driving each meticulous act, stood fully exposed. In the quiet aftermath, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The game was over. The criminal, brilliant and obsessive though they had been, had revealed themselves not through words alone but through the compulsion to act, the habits and gestures that could not be suppressed. Justice would follow, the household would recover, and the carefully traced patterns would remain a testament to the quiet power of observation, patience and understanding. For Miss Marple the case was complete, the final confrontation resolved, and the shadows that had haunted Rosewood Hollow finally lifted. The manor had grown quiet in the aftermath of the butler's confession. Inspector Grayson, satisfied at last that the perpetrator had been apprehended, began organising statements and arranging for the formal processing of the evidence. The household, relieved yet exhausted, moved through its routines with a subdued caution, as though still wary of hidden threats. Miss Marple, however, remained in the drawing-room, seated in her favourite chair, her gaze sweeping the familiar furniture, the chessboard, and the subtle traces of past events. Something, she realised, still did not sit entirely right. It began with a detail that had seemed trivial at first, the gardener's anxious glances toward the library shelves, the slight tremor in the housekeeper's hands as she arranged the silverware, the faint scuff marks near the kitchen door that had gone unnoticed in the flurry of the final confrontation. Each seemed minor, insignificant in the shadow of the butler's confession. Yet, Miss Marple's intuition, honed over decades of observing human behaviour, told her that the confession, while accurate in its account of certain events, might not encompass the full story. She quietly excused herself from the group and wandered the corridors, her eyes scanning for the subtlest of signs. The library, where the vanished night had first drawn her attention, felt strangely altered. A single book, slightly protruding from the shelf, caught her gaze. It was a volume she had examined countless times during the investigation, yet now it seemed to signal something, a message perhaps, or the concealment of a crucial object. She approached, gently tugged the book from its place, and discovered a small envelope hidden behind it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably familiar, yet it did not match the butler's style. Opening it, she found a brief note. "You think the game is over. Observe the corners, they speak truth, the centre cannot." Miss Marple's mind raced. The note implied oversight, misdirection, and a hidden hand still at work. The butler's confession, though genuine in recounting his obsessive manipulations, had been only part of the larger orchestration. Someone else, someone who had remained in plain sight, underestimated or overlooked, had anticipated the investigation's every move, and the confession had served as a convenient shield. Miss Marple retraced her steps through the household, revisiting subtle gestures and micro-expressions she had catalogued over the past days. The housekeeper, with her precise movements and carefully controlled demeanour, suddenly drew her attention anew. There had been moments, fleeting and seemingly innocuous, where her eyes had flicked toward hidden corners, her hands lingered on objects, and her tone carried a slight undertone of suggestion. She had directed the butler subtly, guiding his compulsions, shaping his actions without drawing notice. The gardener, too, had been manipulated, gently nudged into patterns that reinforced the deception. Quietly, Miss Marple observed them from the doorway of the drawing-room, noting the micro-interactions that had seemed so ordinary, a slight nod here, a barely perceptible shift in posture there. It was not the butler alone who had orchestrated the events. It was the housekeeper, an unseen strategist who had engineered much of the chaos, steering the obsessive tendencies of her accomplice to protect her own hidden motives. The subtlety of her manipulation had ensured that suspicion remained fixed elsewhere, allowing her ultimate control to remain concealed until now. The realization struck Miss Marple with that familiar thrill of clarity. The confession had provided resolution in one sense, but the true mastermind had been concealed behind layers of habit, hierarchy, and social expectation. The obsessive butler, though culpable and dangerous, had been guided by a more calculating mind, one that had understood both human behavior and the investigative process with uncanny precision. The final twist was not merely about uncovering a hidden act. It was the revelation of a hidden strategist who had quietly shaped the events from the shadows, orchestrating both crime and investigation to suit her own purposes. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, the quiet triumph of understanding settling over her. The investigation was far from over, but she now had the clarity to anticipate the housekeeper's next moves, to confront the true architect of the chaos, and to ensure that no further deception could undermine justice. The game had seemed complete, the pieces settled, yet the final unexpected twist had emerged, and it was only through patient observation, attention to the smallest details, and a steady reading of human behavior that the truth had finally revealed itself. In the silence of the manor, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to breathe, knowing that the final confrontation, this time with the real mastermind, was imminent. The shadows had shifted once more, but she was ready, calm and prepared, to meet the mind that had hidden in plain sight and bring the full story into the light. Miss Marple waited until evening had draped the manor in shadows, the fading light casting long, shifting lines across the polished floors. The household had been instructed to assemble in the drawing-room once more, this time under her careful direction. Inspector Grayson, still recovering from the shock of realizing the butler had not been the sole architect of the chaos, followed her silently, his expression a mixture of curiosity and exasperation. The housekeeper moved among the staff, her composure flawless, yet Miss Marple's keen eyes detected the almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders, the careful avoidance of direct eye contact with the detective. "I believe," Miss Marple began softly, her voice carrying a calm authority that drew every gaze, that the truth of Mr. Bramble's death, the disappearance of the cook, and the theft of the Ivory Knight has been misunderstood. One person has been held accountable, and yet another, someone who remained in plain sight, was orchestrating events from the shadows. A ripple passed through the assembled household. The housekeeper froze mid-step, fingers brushing lightly over the silver tray she carried, as though instinctively calculating how to respond. Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. The butler's actions, she continued, were guided, manipulated, and shaped. His compulsions and obsessive tendencies were known, anticipated, and exploited. That exploitation was your doing, Mrs. Cartwright. The housekeeper's lips pressed together, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, with a swift, graceful movement, she attempted to excuse herself, edging toward the library door. Miss Marple rose slowly, stepping into her path, the faintest smile playing across her lips. There is no need for flight. The signs have been here all along, if one only observed with care. The subtle glances, the slight adjustments of objects, the guidance given to another to create misdirection, these were your signatures, invisible to all but the attentive eye. Inspector Grayson moved forward, but Miss Marple gently raised a hand. Let us not rush. Observe, and you will see why it is I knew the truth before anyone else did. She gestured to the chessboard on the table. The placement of the pieces, the rotations, and the handling of the knight were all deliberate. The butler could not have orchestrated such precise manipulation alone, yet the consistency of certain actions, the subtle nudges to him and the household, revealed a guiding hand. The housekeeper's eyes widened imperceptibly, and a flicker of colour rose to her cheeks. She remained poised, yet her carefully constructed calm began to crumble. Miss Marple pointed toward the bookshelf where the hidden note had been discovered. Even this, tucked behind a book, was your final assertion of control. You underestimated the power of observation, assuming that a single layer of deception would suffice, yet it only illuminated the truth for those who could see beyond the surface. Mrs. Cartwright's composure broke in a flash, a quick, decisive action. She dropped the silver tray, sending the contents clattering across the floor, and bolted for the door. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Inspector Grayson, but she knew already what was coming. The housekeeper's flight was calculated. She had prepared for contingencies, for escape routes, for the chance that her careful orchestration might be uncovered. She slipped through the corridors, a shadow merging with the darkened hallways. The inspector pursued, but by the time he reached the manor's gates, Mrs. Cartwright had vanished into the night. Justice, at least in the immediate sense, had slipped through their fingers. The household exhaled collectively, a mixture of relief and apprehension settling over them. The butler, subdued and repentant, remained under custody, yet the true architect had eluded capture, leaving behind only the subtle traces of her genius. Miss Marple returned to the library, calm and unhurried. She addressed the household once more, explaining the hidden signs and overlooked cues, the butler's compulsions exploited, the gestures and glances of the housekeeper, the carefully staged misdirections, and the significance of the missing chess knight. Every detail, she explained, had contributed to the revelation of the mastermind's identity, even if that individual had managed to evade immediate apprehension. There are lessons here, she said quietly, in observation, in patience, and in the understanding of human behaviour. The criminal acted with precision and intelligence, and it was only through careful attention to the smallest details that the truth became clear. Even in flight, the pattern they left behind proves the mind that created it. The household listened in awe, some shaken, some reflective, and all aware of the quiet, unsettling knowledge that the true culprit remained free. Miss Marple, however, sat back in her chair, serene. Justice had been partially served, but the game had taught an even greater lesson. The mind that hides in plain sight may evade capture, but it cannot escape the careful gaze of observation, and in time, the housekeeper's brilliance and her inevitable mistakes would lead to her reckoning, for Miss Marple knew that every pattern, no matter how cleverly concealed, could be read by the right eye. The manor had finally settled into an uneasy calm. The immediate crisis was over. The butler was in custody. The household breathed a collective sigh of relief, and the night outside seemed deceptively peaceful. Yet Miss Marple, walking slowly through the quiet halls, felt no sense of finality. The shadows of the evening clung stubbornly to corners and doorways, and the faint, lingering tension in the air suggested that the story was not yet fully written. Even with the housekeeper's flight and the resolution of the butler's role, a minor detail, the kind that seemed irrelevant at first glance, gnawed at the edges of her mind. She paused in the library, surveying the room one last time. The chessboard lay undisturbed, the note behind the book still folded in its subtle crease, as if waiting for a new observer to notice it. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the small, irregular indentation in the carpet near the window where the butler had once fidgeted, the faint trace of a footprint now partly faded. The imprint itself revealed nothing new, yet in combination with the missing housekeeper and the orchestrated sequence of events, it felt like a whisper of unfinished business, a suggestion that the game had more layers than any single confrontation could resolve. She moved into the hallway, noting the quiet routines of the household. The cook, returned and shaken but unharmed, arranged the silverware with an air of nervous diligence. The gardener, still unsettled, mopped the floors with exaggerated care, glancing occasionally toward the manor gates as though expecting the vanished housekeeper to return at any moment. Miss Marple observed them with her usual patience, cataloguing these behaviours, knowing that even small movements could carry hidden meaning. A sudden breeze rustled the curtains near the window, bringing with it the faintest sound of footsteps on the gravel outside. Miss Marple stopped, listening intently. The wind carried no voice, no discernible figure, yet the echo of those steps, distant and hesitant, stirred a memory from earlier in the investigation, the subtle rhythm of a person who moves deliberately, yet is constantly aware of being observed. She made a mental note. The housekeeper had vanished into the night, yes, but the pattern of her movements suggested she had not disappeared entirely from the world of influence she had so carefully maintained. Perhaps, Miss Marple mused, the game was simply paused, awaiting the next act. As she walked down the corridor toward the main entrance, Miss Marple reflected on the many threads of the case. Each act, the vanished night, the disappearance of the cook, the cryptic note, the minor manipulations of the butler, had formed a tapestry of obsession and control. Yet the final puzzle piece, the one that might reveal the true extent of the housekeeper's design, remained tantalizingly out of reach. The criminal mind she had glimpsed in fragments might yet leave traces elsewhere, in another location, under another guise. It was a sobering reminder that no mystery is ever entirely finished. The resolution in one sphere often uncovers deeper questions in another. At the manor gates, she paused, allowing the quiet night to settle around her. The stars overhead were clear, distant, and indifferent, a universe vast and unjudging compared to the human dramas contained within the walls she had just left. She turned briefly, casting one last glance at the manor, now a tableau of normalcy and tension intertwined. The butler's confession had brought partial justice. The housekeeper's flight had delivered an unexpected twist, and yet the faint sense of incompleteness lingered. A subtle rhythm, a pattern of gestures, a quiet message in the movements of those left behind, all hinted at stories still waiting to unfold. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself, a quiet acknowledgement of the enduring truth she had long known: no case is ever entirely closed. Even in apparent resolution, human nature leaves breadcrumbs, minor inconsistencies, and silent signs that will, when observed with care, reveal their secrets in time. With the manor behind her and the night stretching ahead, she walked away, her mind already cataloguing the clues she had gathered and anticipating the next subtle mystery. Somewhere, perhaps not far off, another puzzle waited, one that would test patience, perception, and the enduring power of observation, and she would be ready.